Hi everyone, it's Max or Max Makes Games if you watch my live streams. I just wanted to make a quick video to go over the programming that went into creating Bear Trap, which is my team's Game Jam submission for this last week's Tri Jam. I know during the live streams I don't have a lot of time to explain everything, so I thought this video would be a great time to kind of go in depth about some of the systems that I made for the game itself. If you're into game jamming, they're just these online game development events where you can work by yourself or with a team to create video games in a very limited amount of time. And usually there's not too many restrictions on where you can get art assets or sound assets from. For the most part, you have to program and make a fully working game by the end of the game jam time limit. To make each game jam unique, each game jam usually has its own theme that each game and developer needs to stick to when creating their game. For us, we thought that the best way to stick to the theme of watch your step for this last week's Tri Jam was to make a more top-down experience for a game. Other popular games you might be familiar with from this viewpoint may be Stardew Valley, Legend of Zelda: A Link Between Worlds, and The Binding of Isaac. With this idea in mind, the original pitch for the game was that the player would play as a blind guy who's lost in the forest, and at the same time he's running away from a bear, while also placing down bear traps to slow down the bear. The player has to remember where the bear traps are placed inside the room, which kind of adheres to the watch your step theme, while also avoiding the bear itself. The first thing I wanted to get out of the way for the game was just getting down the player movement itself. For top-down video games, the movement is very simple. You can imagine it just as a coordinate plane, and you're changing your x and y values by some constant number over time as the player wants to move either up, down, left, or right. However, a really small detail that you might not see at first is, well, what if the player holds the right movement key and the up movement key at the same time? This would result in a diagonal vector as shown on the graph. This will form a right triangle, making the hypotenuse of the triangle be that diagonal vector. And as we all know, the hypotenuse is the longest side, and in this case would be the fastest speed that the player can move inside the game, making it so that the player effectively would always want to be holding both keys to move. Taking all this into account, we have a fully working movement system that also takes into account collisions within the first 10 minutes of the game jam. Okay. Um, this is basically it. Exactly. Okay. Basic collision done. The next step to creating the game was creating the bear's AI. The bear was to move to the player and not get stuck on any of the trees or obstacles that were part of the game's room, but always find an efficient path to make its way to the player. In a sense, always chasing and putting pressure on the player. Thankfully, GameMaker has a really great way of dealing with this, especially in a top-down setting, and it's called motion planning. What motion planning effectively does is that you can take a full scan of your room or the screen of your game and essentially make it into a grid that is readable to a game object itself. Essentially, it'll mark down where it can move in the room and where it can't move in the room. In this representation of the game so far, we have the light green square being the player, the red squares being collision objects, and the brown square being the bear. Now you can see when the screen flashes a light green color, the game shows the bear's visual representation of where it thinks it can move, being the light green, and where it knows it cannot move, being the red. Now taking all this into account, the bear can now create its own path to the player represented by the white line drawn in the direction of the player around all the obstacles. The next step was to decide how much of the room we wanted to reveal to the player. And it soon became apparent that the best thing to do is not to make the player completely blind, but just to very much limit the amount of vision that the player has in the room. The way to go about this is by using surfaces. Now let's say that we want to have a surface on top of the entire game, and this would act as a complete layer of darkness, concealing much of the map from the player. However, what I'm able to do is draw a circle in the middle of the surface, or wherever I want it to be, that would follow the player and represent sort of a light or a flashlight the player is holding and reveal a small radius around the player itself. I then subtract the percent RGB values of the circle from the original black surface and it leaves a hole in the black surface that looks something like this. Actually, that pretty much is what it's gonna look like. I don't know why I just cuts out, but like you can only see like this will be even smaller in the game, but now you can see I can only see what's directly like around me. Great, so far I have player movement done, motion planning for the bear, and a darkness and lighting system through surfaces. However, I'm missing a pretty key part of the game, and that's trap placement. Since traps are meant to also be something that could possibly harm the player and be a pretty big drawing point for sticking to the theme of watch your step, I figured that it would be a lot better for game progression if the player was not able to choose when they wanted to place a trap, and instead could only really change where they place the trap. And this would be done by always placing a trap at a certain time and then speeding up that time. So essentially, the game gets harder because there'd be more traps later in the level. Just really quick, I wanted to show at this point in the game development, I had created a basic trap that would be represented at first by pink to show that it just had been placed, and then blue shows when the trap is actually activated. As you can also see, the traps work to effectively slow down the bear as well. Another detail you may have seen that might be confusing is the white circles appearing around the bear. Now, I haven't explained this so far in the video yet, but in the stream I had actually programmed that before I actually programmed the actual bear trap. These circles are one of the examples of visual representations of audio inside the game. Because the player was not able to see much of the level, sounds became a great way of conveying information to the player. Sounds in the game are used to not only tell where the bear is in the level, but also when a bear trap itself is triggered. And these visual representations of audio became the best way to show where in the level these events were taking place. With all these systems now in place, I finally move on to the last part of game development, which is asset implementation. If you couldn't tell already from the usage of just squares to represent all the art assets so far in the game, I definitely can't make these games all on my own. And I work with two other really talented individuals, AR96 who works on audio and music, and Epic Shaner who does all the art for the games. So after implementing all the assets I was given, adding a bit more level design and progression to the game, I finally finished the final build and submission for Bear Trap. Just so you have a sneak peek of how the game looks and feels, here's a little bit of gameplay. That's all that I'll show for now, but please note that the full game can be downloaded and played for Windows on itch.io, and I'll be leaving the download link in the description box if you want to check it out. Game development and game jams are really fun for me, and making this type of educational content was really fun for me as well. So if you enjoyed, please like. If you have any questions, you can comment, and subscribe if you want to see more stuff like this in the future, because I'll probably be making more content about game jams that I participate in. So thank you for watching.